University, and Yushu has a bachelor's degree from Zhejiang University in China, and she has a master's and a PhD from the University of Illinois. She did postdoctoral work at the Woodwell Climate Center in Woods Hole, and she's been, I guess it's about a year or so at Lamont.
A little bit more than half a year.
Yeah, okay, so it's not even a full year. Okay, so she's quite new, and she's going to talk about, well, something about soil health. But we're talking because she measures greenhouse gas fluxes from soils, which I do, and so she came to visit me in New York, and I said, well, you're going to have to come to the Carey Institute and see Jane's new experiment and meet with people here, and so I think she's having a nice visit, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet you. I am Yushu, and I would like to say today I will be talking about monitoring soil health and the associated agroecosystem outcomes. And as you can see from the title here, that my work is kind of at the intersection between data science and soil science. So specifically, I try to leverage field data, lab data, web survey data, as well as remote sensing data sets, and then combine those with various modeling tools to better understand soil health and agroecosystem outcomes. So start with introduction. First, there are some key terminologies for today, just in case you were wondering what they mean. I will start with what soil health is and why we need to care about soil health. Then I will be moving on to soil carbon and carbon sequestration. I will also be talking about climate-smart agricultural and agroecosystem outcomes. So first, why soil health and why it's important? Soil health is the continued capacity for soil to function as a vital living system that can sustain plants, animals, and also humans. And soil health can also connect agricultural and soil science with policy, stakeholder needs, and also sustainable supply chain management. So to be more concrete, it's easy to understand that healthy soils can support better animal and plant growth in croplands, grasslands, and sometimes forests. And also soil health is related to environmental health, because we understand that in some cases when we have healthy soils, that might mean reduced environmental contamination. And later on in my talk, I will also be talking about why soil health is related to climate change adaptation. And then lastly, soil health is related to human health in many different aspects because of the connection between soil health and environmental sustainability, climate change mitigation, and also ecosystem resilience and production. So here, sometimes you might be wondering why you hear the term soil carbon or carbon sequestration more frequently than soil health. The main reason here is because soil carbon is closely associated with this climate change mitigation potential. So for example, looking at the graph on the left, you can see that soil contained about 2,500 gigatons of carbon in comparison to plant and atmosphere, which contain about 560 and 760 gigatons of carbon, respectively. However, it's not just the total amount of carbon that matters, it's also carbon sequestration, which means the rate for us to capture, secure, and store carbon from the atmosphere. So in this case, even a very small fraction of carbon sequestration in soil can mean a lot of potential for climate change mitigation. And that's why we can see some statements like here from USDA that the most practical way for us to enhance soil health today is to try to promote better soil carbon management. There's like a carbon-centric type of terminology in all those statements. And looking at the graph on the right, you can see that land is the major source for carbon, but at the same time, land can also be a major sink for carbon. So the idea is to try to increase land carbon sinks while reducing carbon emissions when we think about soil carbon. And then the other terminology that's related to soil health or soil carbon management is climate-smart agricultural practices, which can enable landowners and also land managers to respond to climate change by reducing or removing greenhouse gases and also building resilience, but at the same time sustainably increasing agricultural productivity and income. So we already talked about the mitigation side of the things. The reason that climate climate-smart agriculture can also help with climate change adaptation is because we're adopting principles such as minimizing disturbance, maximizing biodiversity, maximize soil cover, and also maximizing living roots, which can hopefully lead to improved ecosystem health and also ecosystem resilience. However, the effectiveness of different types of climate-smart agricultural practices and the combination of them in mitigating or offsetting greenhouse gas emissions really depends on the interaction of many different factors, both climate and management and also soil and crops. So in this case, it can be a little bit challenging to do this type of quantification to understand agroecosystem outcomes. So my work is really centered around the concept of soil health, and I try to improve the evaluation and quantification of various agroecosystem outcomes, specifically focusing on soil organic carbon and carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions, with a particular emphasis on nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas that has a global warming potential that's about 273 times greater than carbon dioxide. And I also look at water and nutrient dynamics and also ecosystem productivity. Those are related to soil health. And due to time limit today, I will be focusing mostly on the soil organic carbon and also nitrous oxide side of things for today's talk. So what are the key challenges for those type of quantifications? The first challenge is that there is a disconnect between soil health interpretation and the various agroecosystem outcomes. And this is because when we evaluate soil health, in a lot of cases, we measure those soil properties called soil health indicators, and then we look at where the value is in terms of a large database. So we're doing this type of interpretation based on data distribution. However, it's important to think about how the soil health measurements are actually related to agroecosystem outcomes. So here is an example where I carried out a review or meta-analysis study to look at 3 representative soil health indicators reflecting soil biochemical properties. And I figured that most of the studies have looked at the responsiveness of these indicators to different management practices, but relatively few of the studies have connected directly those soil health indicators with agroecosystem outcomes, specifically greenhouse gas emissions. And another complexity here is that sometimes when we have a soil that can lead to improved ecosystem productivity, they might also lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions in some cases, specifically for some soil health indicators that are related to microbial activities. So in this case, the commonly used soil health interpretation function that follows this more is better type of pattern will probably need to be modified by considering sustainable goals by modifying the values down at the higher end of the soil health indicator concentration level. So that requires us to have a better understanding of how soil health indicators are related to sustainable or some type of potentially negative agroecosystem outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions. And then there are many different challenges associated with the quantification of soil organic carbon and nitrous oxide. Particularly, both of them are very variable in space. And nitrous oxide fluxes are also highly variable in time, and you can observe nitrous oxide peaks at a daily or even hourly and finer time steps. Soil organic carbon doesn't change as much, but that doesn't mean that the determination of soil organic carbon changes are that easy, because this type of determination is usually complicated by the interaction of spatial and temporal variability, especially if we can go back to the original point to do repeated sampling. And then to make it more challenging, there's usually limited in-situ observations available for us to delineate this type of heterogeneity. And my approach here in my research, usually I try to take advantage of evolving data sets and then try to combine those data sets with advanced modeling techniques to improve our understanding and quantification of those agroecosystem outcomes. So there's also challenges associated with different scales. Usually the data points that we take from the fields, they are looking at the point level. However, there's anticipation that we need to be able to upscale our estimates to the local, regional, or even broader scales with reasonable accuracy. And my work focuses on both field type of work and also broad scale quantification. So I try to overcome different type of challenges at different scales. And 2 main research questions questions today that are related to scales. First is, how do we accurately quantify broad-scale agroecosystem outcomes, which would be most relevant to support policymaking? The second is, how do we tackle spatial temporal variability with relatively limited sampling resources? But this type of information is important for us to improve site-specific agricultural management. So at the broader scale, the main idea is to try to utilize refined data sets from survey, remote sensing, and data fusion, and try to take advantage of various different type of modeling tools. At the finer scale, the idea is to try to develop some sort of targeted or strategic sampling plan, and then combine those with important site and environmental factors that drives agroecosystem outcomes so that we can continuously improve our modeling tools and quantification system. So I have two methodology sessions for today's talk. It's just because methodology is something important in my research. The first methodology session is dedicated to various data sets. So first, what type of field and lab measurements are available for soil research? The most obvious answer would be soil sampling. And for those of you who might not be as familiar with soil science, the idea is that we go out, dig soils up, and then we process those soil samples. And in many cases, we can test the soil physical, chemical, and biological properties as soil health indicators after the samples are being processed. But we can also measure some soil properties also in situ using field measurements as well. And for some other soil properties like soil moisture, we can also carry out sensor-based monitoring in the field. Here I'm also including vegetation sampling. It might be a little surprising to you, but it's because in some cases people might not have the resource to examine directly what's below ground. So they have to make some type of assumption or estimation based on what's above ground. And that's where this type of vegetation sampling comes into play. And this is very common in remote sensing or model-based studies. Flux tower is also very important because it can provide us with information about carbon dioxide exchange between the atmosphere and also the biosphere. This type of equipment is usually relatively expensive, so they are usually supported by network-based monitoring efforts. And we can also sample nitrous oxide and methane using chamber-based method, which is usually cheaper than flux towers, but also covers a smaller footprint, as you can see from the figure here. So the other thing is that it's impossible for one single team or a small team to take a lot of soil samples and get all the data sets that are needed. So if we are looking at broad-scale quantification, it's important that we should be able to leverage multiple larger-scale data sets. And one way to do this is to collect metadatabases using data mining or meta-analysis approach. So here I'm giving two examples. The example on the left shows you that I collected a database on nitrous oxide emissions, and there's more than 2,000 observations from US agricultural soils. And in addition to nitrous oxide, I also collected information on potential key influencing factors of nitrous oxide so that we can build model out of it. And based on my study, there are multiple factors that are identified to be potentially influential and can be considered in the national or broader scale nitrous oxide accounting efforts. For example, we see soil texture and tillage are very influential for the estimates. Specifically, no tillage in my study showed that they can potentially be associated with lower nitrous oxide emissions due to decreased disturbance. And then the example on the right shows you that I collected another data set to look at soil health indicators and how they respond to different conservation management practices. And the biggest contrast here was between the paired grassland and croplands for all three soil health indicators. So this shows that there's a potential for us to improve soil health if we can restore grasslands in some cases. And another way to get larger scale database is to resort to survey data sets. So here I did a comparison of soil organic carbon stocks from different national survey or broad scale data sets that are available. They're extracted or being recalculated based on the spatial metrics. And then the biggest issue, as you can see here, is that the estimates seem to vary a lot among different surveys. So in this case, we really need to figure out what's the best way to quality control and utilize these survey data sets to support broad scale carbon counting efforts. And another data set I want to mention would be the remote sensing and environmental data sets, because they can provide very important estimates for key environmental drivers that are needed for us to better understand soil carbon and nitrogen dynamics. So here is an example where I used the Sentinel-2 satellite images and combined those with environmental data sets such as climate factors, as well as rapid field measurements such as cover crop height to look at cover crop biomass and also nitrogen content. And in my study, I also looked at carbon to nitrogen ratio, which controls the amount of nitrogen credits that can potentially become available to subsequent crops. Even though this is more looking at the above ground part, but the idea is that we need this type of data set to further support our estimation about soil carbon and nitrogen dynamics and subsequently nitrous oxide emissions. So in my study, you can see that the satellite indices, which are shown as S in the figure on the right, they can explain quite a significant portion of variability in our data set. But of course, when you combine satellite images with other type of environmental data layers, we can explain even more variability in the cover crop data set. And instead of using remote sensing and satellite images, we can also use more proximal-based sensors. So it's like a field and lab sensors, which have the benefit of being non-destructive and relatively fast compared to conventional wet lab tests. So here's an example where I utilized the lab-based spectroscopy to examine a suite of soil health indicators. And as you can see here, as you can see here, that the best model performance that I obtained from my study was for soil organic carbon and total nitrogen, but the medium accuracy was also observed for enzyme tests and nutrient measurements, although the model also showed relatively low performance for estimating soil pH and several other soil health indicators related to carbon and nitrogen cycling. So this really points to the need for us to further improve the model for estimating some soil health indicators by incorporating additional training data sets. It would be, we all understand the importance of taking all those ground truth data, but that doesn't mean that we're going to dig up as much soil as possible in all different locations, because those soil sampling efforts can be costly and also labor intensive. So the idea here is to improve the efficiency of such campaigns by designing targeted field sampling campaigns. And here I'm giving an example where I try to come up with a management zone-based design to better monitor soil nitrous oxide emissions and identify controlling factors at the site level by dividing the site into different zones. So here, this type of management zone-based design, it has been very widely adopted by precision agriculture, and the goal is to try to optimize crop productivity. The issue is that this type of design hasn't been very commonly validated or evaluated for environmental nitrogen losses like nitrous oxide emissions. So what I did was to adapt this type of classical design. So first I have the covariates in the green boxes that are being used very commonly for delineating spatial variability in soil fertility. But I also added additional information in the, it looks gray here, the gray boxes, and these environmental covariates are hypothesized to be related to environmental nitrogen losses. Then I carried out spatial clustering analysis and divided the site into different zones as a conceptual map that you can see on the right. And then I monitored nitrous oxide and also those environmental factors within different zones to try to get a better understanding of what's going on in different regions. And then the other thing here is that sometimes we just don't quite have the data set that is needed to support our specific type of research, so we have to combine some data sets from existing data sources. So here I'm giving an example where I developed a fine resolution data set for nitrogen fertilizer inputs. And this type of data set is important not only for estimating nitrous oxide emissions, but also for many other key agroecosystem outcomes, such as nitrogen leaching and crop yields. So as you can see in this figure here, that the data set that we have specifically at the state level, which are shown in the blue boxes, the color might be a little hard to see here, is that these state level data set are crop specific. So I put corn pictures here next to these data sets for nitrogen input rates. However, when we go to county-level data set, which are shown in the yellow boxes, we don't have those corn signs. So the issue is that we don't have crop-specific nitrogen input data set at the county level. And this is not very good for us to estimate county-level nitrous oxide emissions. For example, we have to go with either the coastal resolution data set or the data set that's not really developed for corn, for example. So what I did was to develop data fusion approach. First, I tried to use a top-down approach to allocate the total amount of nitrogen at the county level to different types of crops by combining a whole suite of National Survey data sets that are available. And then as a comparison, I also did empirical estimates of corn nitrogen needs using remote sensing inputs and also using National Survey data sets that are available. And then with these two data sets, we're able to calculate a difference that can help us understand corn nitrogen balance as an approximation. And then the second aspect of my methodology session is about modeling. So today I want to talk about two big categories of modeling, the empirical modeling and the process-based modeling. And on this slide, I would like to talk about specifically empirical modeling. So you often hear that we can use machine learning approach to understand soils, and this type of approach is also being referred to as digital soil mapping approach. So the idea is that we're following the principle where soil properties can be estimated using soil forming factors, including soil, climate, biotic, topographic, parent material, time, and location variables. And it's not surprising that there's a rapid growth of use of this type of empirical models to understand broad-scale soil organic carbon because it's fast and efficient. However, according to my review study, which looked at particularly regional and national scale studies, I realized that there's only about half of these studies that carried out some sort of independent validation and uncertainty analysis. So there's still a lot of work to do to improve this type of models. And most of the models have adopted climate, biotic, or topographic factors, and this is not coincidence. It's because those data sets are most accessible from remote sensing and surveys. But you can also argue that some other factors, such as geological factors representing parent materials, are important but needs to be incorporated more in this type of modeling system. And I also did a case study by using this type of empirical model to estimate one of the National Soil Survey data set that we have called Rapid Assessment of Soil Carbon. The issue is that some of the extremely high values here can't really be modeled using this approach. So we need to figure out how to best quality control and utilize survey data set, which emphasized the point that I mentioned previously. And then we can also use process-based models to estimate soil organic carbon and nitrous oxide emissions, which means that we're developing a whole suite of mathematical equations to represent the reality. But of course, it's more like a simplified version of reality based on what we can handle so far. So here is an example where I adapted a classical soil model called the Sentry model to estimate soil organic carbon changes and also nitrous oxide emissions. So in this model, the main inputs include crop properties, weather data, soil data, and also management data. And this model was calibrated against observed multi-year crop yields as well as soil organic carbon, which was available at one point in time for the model. So basically using model calibration, we're able to tune model parameters related to crop growth and also soil organic matter decay in general. And this model adopts a three-pole structure. So we have active, slow, and passive poles of soil organic matter, which is meant to delineate the complexity of soil organic matter. But of course, when you see different models, you can see maybe they would have 5 poles or 7 different poles. So this part could be different. The idea here is that we have an active pole that represents the above ground and below ground plant materials, as well as animal materials like manure that have relatively fast decomposition rate. So the turnover time, which means the time for the material to stay in this pool, ranges from several days to years. And we also have passive soil organic matter pool, which means that these materials are relatively stabilized and are more resistant to decomposition. So the turnover time is much longer, from decades to several thousand years. But that doesn't mean that this pool is not important, because some management practices, such as cover cropping and crop residue incorporation, can still influence the relative contribution of the stabilized soil organic matter pool. So that can influence long-term soil carbon sequestration. And then we also have this slow soil organic matter pool, which is in between and has a turnover rate that's between years to decades. So when we model nitrous oxide, that figure would be much more complicated and bigger than here, so I didn't show all the details. The idea is that we're modeling nitrogen cycling in a similar fashion, but we're trying to connect carbon and nitrogen cycling using parameters such as carbon to nitrogen ratio. And here I would like to show a case study where I utilized various data sets and modeling tools that I just introduced to you to improve the monitoring of rangeland carbon dynamics. So the reason that I'm interested in rangeland is because rangeland has a significant global presence and has a very high, very huge but highly uncertain potential for carbon sequestration through improved rangeland management. This type of uncertainty can be derived from extensive range sizes, limited data availability, and also the very huge spatial and temporal heterogeneity. So the objective here was to build a data-driven framework that can help us leverage knowledge of rangeland carbon dynamics with multi-source data set that can help improve rangeland carbon monitoring. So for this project, we developed a rangeland carbon tracking and monitoring system. Later on, I will be referring to it as RCTM. And in this system, first, we have developed a high-performance computing platform-based baseline soil carbon mapping approach that is coupled with designing this targeted or strategic field sampling plan. And then in this system, we also have model calibration and model validation, and we have refined some of the model inputs through data fusion, and we also have visualized model outcomes by developing web-based applications, so it's more like an interactive platform. And the main inputs for this model, first we have remote sensing data combined from different satellite sensors. We also have soil information, climate information, as well as vegetation type. So for the first step, we estimated GPP, which is gross primary productivity. So it's like an index that can help us understand grassland productivity. And this is estimated by combining remote sensing data set with various environmental modifiers and feed that information into light use efficiency algorithm. And then we estimated above ground and below ground biomass and litter from GPP and environmental modifiers before feeding this type of information into different soil organic matter pools. So this is similar to this three-pool structure that I introduced previously, but the names here are different because here we're focusing on the measurable soil carbon pool. So it's not just the conceptual. For example, this means particulate organic carbon, which is more similar to more like an active carbon type of pool that we have in the model. And this model was calibrated mostly using network-based data set from Flux Tower. And our main output from this model include the spatial temporal estimates of rangeland productivity and also carbon dynamics, which is fed into a decision support tool type of system. So first, how did we develop this baseline soil carbon mapping approach? So for developing this type of approach, we need to combine two types of data set. First data set is national survey data set that's available at the broad scale. So we need to select which data set we want to use. And then the second data set is from the field scale. And as you can see from the figure here, that this slide is about how to select the national survey data set for model training. And I used three different strategies. So the first strategy here was to apply this regional model directly. So what you can see here from the western US rangelands. And then this regional model has a much wider range compared to the three case study site, for example, we have here. And this is a PCA plot. So basically, we're looking at a statistical space that is delineated using various environmental variables representing soil forming factors. And then we can zoom in, and then we can have a more localized approach, which is the strategy 2, that is the site-based model. So basically, you can see that most of the gray dots from the first strategy are being ruled out, because here we're only interested in the data points that are most representative of site 1. And then we can zoom in even further and develop this pixel or point-based model. So in this case, I'm visualizing them as the small red circles. So basically, you're only selecting the data points within the small red circles to target at the center red dots here for building the model. So we're really trying to take advantage of the environmental covariates to select what is most significantly similar to the points we want to model. And it's not surprising that in this case, the regional model has very poor model performance. The site-based model performs better, but it's not nearly as good as the point-based model for one of the case study sites we looked at. But this is not, sometimes the difference is not as significant for other case study sites. But this requires us to think about whether we need to go with this type of more detailed modeling, because this requires more computational power and for both selecting the training data set and also building the models. And for selecting local samples, we need to think about both the optimal number and also optimal locations. So here on the right, let's look at how we select those locations. So basically, we did a clustering analysis using environmental variables to divide the site into many different clusters. And then within each cluster, we did condition lighting hypercube sampling scheme to make sure that the sampling point can maximize the representation of these clusters. And then with those targeted points, we can develop this type of high-resolution estimates of baseline soil carbon by combining the dataset with the training datasets we selected from the previous slide. And in order to determine the optimal number, here I'm looking at utilizing different number of local samples and combine those with the national survey dataset. And an example here is that at this site, we need about 10 to 15 local samples, because a further increase in the local sample numbers, as you can see from the x-axis, didn't really improve model performance. And this site has about 10 square kilometers, but we also find that the local number probably needs to be higher when we have larger ranges. So this type of number is different. And in some cases, as I mentioned, that the model inputs are probably not sufficient. And in this case, we were looking at spatial resolution. Specifically, when we try to carry out our initial modeling to look at rangeland productivity, we figured that there are all those artificial tiles. And so we try to compare our modeled outputs with various model inputs and find out that soil moisture is the reason, because the publicly available data set doesn't have enough resolution. So that's motivated us to try to develop this machine learning digital soil mapping approach to get more refined soil moisture patterns. So what we did here is that for the first step, we collected the national soil moisture data set, tried to quality control and harmonize those, and then based on those data points and a whole suite of environmental variables that we consider to be related to soil moisture, we're able to develop a machine learning model using the collaboration data set. So the covariates, for example, we included the land surface model derived soil moisture data set. So that's like a baseline data set. And then we downscaled that using remote sensing data, soil databases, climate data, topographic maps, and also land use and land cover data. And then after the model is calibrated and validated, we can apply the model at the gridded scale. So in this case, we were extracting all those covariates at the gridded scale, and then we can predict the soil moisture at relatively high spatial and temporal resolution. And we attempted it for long-term prediction because we used remote sensing data that's available for a longer term. We also attempted multiple depths, but you can see what happens in the next slide. So here, of course, we get much more refined spatial pattern after this type of downscaling, which is very helpful. But when we look at the model accuracy, we can also see that the model accuracy decreased drastically with deeper soil depths. And this is not surprising because this type of digital soil mapping approach is more empirical. And also because remote sensing can see what's above ground, what's at the surface depths better than what's below the surface. So the idea is that we need to further improve soil moisture modeling by potentially combining this type of empirical approach with more process-based approach like hydrological models. That would be the next step. And for model calibration and validation here, we leveraged this network-based data set basically from Ameriflex and NEON. So they have flux tower data sets. And in those data sets, they have measured net ecosystem exchange, NEE, which is the net exchange of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and also the biosphere. And in some cases, this type of data set can also be partitioned into GPP that I mentioned before, as well as ecosystem respiration. So we are also able to carry out model calibration using GPP. And we were able to retain about 60 rangeland sites within the western and midwestern US, and we divided those into different vegetation types to develop vegetation type specific parameters. And here is an example of our model calibration and validation results. So after model calibration, we're able to get modeled GPP versus flux tower derived GPP, which has relatively good accuracy here. And we also looked at and validated our model using the soil organic carbon data set that are available from the NEON network. And we got a decent model fit with R-square equals to 0.58. But the issue is that the model bias is pretty large. So in this case, we really need to keep improving our model to be able to better capture the magnitude of soil organic carbon stocks. And here's an example that we can actually apply this type of model across different scales. For example, we try to apply our CTM to look at 33 perennial and annual grassland sites averaged from the Ameriflex network. And we kind of see that there's a slow increase of soil organic carbon over time, which is related to a slow increase in GPP over time. And according to our trained and correlation analysis, this is mostly driven by precipitation. But as a further step, we need to further distinguish the effects of climate and management. So in addition to improving our modeling tools, we also need to use this type of tool to better understand some scientific questions, because some of the sites have improved management, but some of the sites might have more constant management. So we want to see the contrast. And then the example on the right shows you that we try to apply the model at the field scale to derive 30-meter resolution estimates of soil carbon changes over time. And we talked to the rancher here and give him this type of image. And he said this type of pattern agrees with what he thinks about soil water stress at the site level. But of course, if we want to continue improve this model for site-based application, we need to better marry local field samples with this type of regional parameters that we have developed. And here is an example of feeding this type of information into a decision support tool. So if you want, later on, you can scan the QR code and look at it on the computer. It might not show up that well on the phone because it's relatively large. So we have a much more complicated decision support tool than the demo here. But the key here is that we are developing a type of tool where users will be able to define the area of interest, like drawing a point or a polygon, and then they can visualize the agroecosystem outcomes on the right panel. And we're also showing time series data of both outcomes as well as key driving factors such as precipitation, so that users will be able to see what different climate scenarios will do to soil carbon or other type of outcomes that they're interested in. And then I would also like to introduce the very short case study too, which is the quantification of soil nitrous oxide emissions from the US Corn Belt. So here, first the question is how well can we do in terms of this type of broad scale quantification of nitrous oxide emissions? The main method that has been utilized at the broad scale, like a national or regional scale, to estimate nitrous oxide is to utilize this type of emission factors developed by IPCC. So in the tier 1 approach, we assume that nitrous oxide is a function of nitrogen input rate, which is modified by the general cropping system category. And in this updated tier 1 approach, we have more details, including different climate zones as well as different nitrogen types, but it's still not super detailed. And in tier 2 approach, we try to develop more country or regional specific emission factors. So in this case, usually we need to leverage metadatabases. So that's like the database I showed you in the methodology session, where I collected 2,000 observations of nitrous oxides. That's where this type of approach comes in. But in some cases, we might be interested in the interaction among different factors, and also to have more finer resolution estimates rather than just relying on emission factors. So that requires us to use process-based model as the tier 3 approach. So basically, I ran the model that I introduced to you during the methodology session as well. So that's like a process-based model, tier 3 approach. And I try to understand the influence of different management and weather scenarios on nitrous oxide emissions, and with a particular focus here on crop rotations, nitrogen input type, and also tillage types here. The motivation behind this was to improve GHG accounting for this corn biofuel production for this project. And here you can see a comparison between modeled and measured results. The colors are kind of funny here, different from my computer. Anyway, so when you look at the modeled results, which are on the left side of each figure, and compare those with measured results on the right side of each figure for those comparison of different management treatments, you can see that the measured results are associated with a much larger data range, and that's not quite captured by the model. So that's one thing we need to improve in terms of our model applicability. And then the other thing is that even though fertilizer form and tillage types, you can see that the ranking is kind of similar. The ranking is a little different for nitrogen input type, synthetic versus organic. And this might be because the organic system is much more complex compared to the conventional system. So this really points to the need for us to further improve our conventional process-based models to better account for different factors that can influence nitrous oxide emissions from organic system. And then here's the comparison of different tiers of estimates. So tier 2 estimates is based on the metadatabase that I introduced to you. And we can see that the model estimates, when we lump all the data points together, are only slightly lower than tier 2 estimates. So this might mean that the model is giving relatively reasonable magnitude estimates. And these two estimates are in between the tier 1 estimate, which distinguishes wet zone and also dry zone. However, this type of comparison and validation definitely needs to be continuously improved, because the validation data points from my tier 2 metadatabase is very unevenly distributed. For example, we only have 2% of the data points from the cover crop phase, and we only have about 16% of the data points from organic nitrogen inputs. So lastly, I would like to introduce several of the upcoming projects from my brand new lab at Le Mans Doherty Earth Observatory. And here are some examples. So the first example is a project that is sponsored by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, National Audubon Society, and World Wildlife Fund. So the idea is to try to leverage a huge soil and vegetation monitoring system that we have, which covers more than 2 million acres. And we're interested in using this type of data set to improve, calibrate, and also validate RCTM type of model and also other type of modeling systems, so that we can apply the model to better predict various agroecosystem outcomes. But because our collaborators, they also have the background where we include birds and wildlife, so we also would have data sets such as wildlife biodiversity and vegetation traits. So in this case, we want to be able to explore the relationship between carbon sequestration, soil health, and ecosystem productivity, as well as several other agroecosystem outcomes that the various stakeholders connected to this network are interested in. And then the second project is also a new project that will start next year, which is sponsored by USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. So the idea is to try to improve soil survey efforts across different scales. So at the broader scale, the objective here is to utilize more like an empirical approach, deep learning approach, and also leverage this large soil health indicator data set from the various national soil survey data set. So some of the data set I introduced to you previously in the slide, but there's additional data set that are being developed in the process. So we're going to combine those data set, quality control those, harmonize those, and then try to extract environmental management and other remote sensing indices and try to build this model to see how well we can understand the spatial temporal dynamics in those soil health indicators. And then the second objective is more at the site level. So this year we're establishing this campus experimental forest site to carry out new soil monitoring program. Because this site we have been taking measurements on tree health and tree growth, but we haven't done anything on the soil side. So I came in and we decided we're going to take students to take soil health measurements, soil carbon stock changes, and also measure greenhouse gas emissions. So the idea is to further improve this type of strategic sampling plan and to also think about indices we can incorporate in order to improve the monitoring of forest soil health and better marrying those forest measurements with soil measurements and also remote sensing and drone measurements. And then the third objective is to try to establish platforms to better support education and data communication type of activities. So this is related to the decision support tool prototype that I showed you before. So in this process, we're involving model calibration validation, sensor data processing, survey processing, and field and lab measurements. And students are pretty excited about this type of project. So the third example I would like to show, I will leverage part of the support from my new FFAR New Innovator Award and also leverage some of the support from my collaborators. And my main collaborator for this project includes some New York-based conservation NGO organizations and also AgMIP, which is an organization that does agricultural model intercomparison and also ensemble, and they are coordinated from Columbia University. So the idea is to try to leverage some of those local data sets which have been, and some of these organizations have been monitoring carbon changes over time, over the past decade. And we are particularly interested in data scarce system, which I would be defining it with the type of data that is not sufficient in my metadatabases, such as organic system, diversified cropping system that has cover crops, and also grassland. We also don't have as much data here compared to corn and soybean fields in the in US Midwest. So in this case, we want to evaluate management effect on soil carbon and nitrous oxide emissions. We also want to evaluate the relationship between carbon sequestration with other type of agroecosystem outcomes that our stakeholders are interested in, because these organizations, they have big networks of stakeholders and they're interested in a very large range of things such as food quality. So that's the idea why we want to be able to connect with stakeholders and transform local and regional food systems as a future target. So we want to, in this process, improve open source modeling tools through the collaboration with AgMIP, and also improve the various data sets so that the research community will be able to utilize our modeling tools and data sets. So right now we're starting with the more Hudson Valley region, but we're hoping to expand this through this type of global network that AgMIP has. And we also want to be able to improve decision support tools to benefit stakeholders. So key takeaways from today's talk. First, there's still very large uncertainty in ecosystem modeling, especially associated with the data scarce system that I talked about, the organic system, grassland system, diversified cropping system. So we need to have more accurate quantification of soil carbon and nitrous oxide emissions. And in order to do that, we probably need to also improve the various data sources by quality controlling them or sometimes downscaling those data sets so that it can help us in terms of serving as good model input data set and also for model calibration and validation. And at the field scale, designing optimized the field sampling plan by taking advantage of survey and also remote sensing-based environmental data sets can really help improve the efficiency of site-level monitoring. But I also showed you an example where this localized model was able to perform better than the more regional model. So in this case, we also need to figure out how to best utilize the variables that represent various soil health indicators and use them for local modeling. And then, lastly, it's important that we come back to the concept of soil health, even though I was talking about soil carbon and nitrous oxide a lot. But the idea is that we want to collect a data set that contain both soil health indicators and also the agroecosystem outcomes. And in some cases, we might not always have the measurements of agroecosystem outcomes. So that's where we can potentially fill some of the data gap using the various modeling tools and data fusion techniques that I introduced today. Thank you very much for paying attention to the talk today. I think I covered a lot of topics, and I would like to appreciate all those collaborators that I've worked with previously. So for what I'm presenting today, because I'm starting a new lab, so most of the contents were from my PhD work and postdoc work, so I really appreciate the collaboration. But the last few slides are about the new project that I'm very excited to kick off very soon. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. I'm curious, well, I have a lot of questions, but the first one I'll start with is, I was curious to see your occasional deep soil modeling efforts, and I'm just kind of curious how frequently you think most of your modeling is happening unsoil carbon, like the top 10 centimeters, versus how often you can incorporate depth into your model.
Okay, sounds good. So for my nitrous oxide model, I would think it.
So could you repeat the question or
Yes.
summarize the question for people listening online?
Sorry, I forgot about that. Okay, so the question is about deep soil modeling because soil depth is very important. And the question is, how often do I incorporate this deeper level information in my model versus just looking at the surface depths? So the answer is that first, it really depends on the model. For the nitrous oxide model that I'm working on, actually it incorporates multiple depths because in each depth you can consider that the parameter is probably different, and you also need to simulate this type of leaching, runoff, and percolation, and all sorts of hydrological processes that can connect to different depths. But the tricky part is that even though we have those algorithms there, those models, they're calibrated using some other data set that might not fit with the data set that you're looking at. So in order to make sure your model has good applicability, then it's important to actually take some of the soil samples to verify those parameters, but that's not always available. And I would also say that the remote sensing driven model that I presented for grassland, that one is relatively weak in terms of the consideration of depth, because that model, we're building that based on the assumption that we don't always have management information, so we can't incorporate management outcomes, and in that case, we have to more rely on remote sensing data. And as I mentioned, remote sensing data doesn't see that deep. So that's why the magnitude of soil carbon estimation is kind of off for that model, and we're trying to fix that problem by thinking about multiple depths as the next step. Yes?
Have you thought about using C or L band SAR for the remote sensing inputs? And then second question is, with the launch, we're going to be getting more hyperspectral data that will be freely available. Do you think that that could be something that's incorporated into the decision-making tool?
Yes, the question is, have I thought about using C and L and that type of bands from remote sensing? And then the second question is about the utilization of hyperspectral bands. So first about C and L bands, I haven't used that in my projects yet, but I would think that they are very relevant, especially for some of the estimates for soil moisture. I think that would be more related, so that's definitely something we want to incorporate. So one weakness of the soil moisture study I did is that we want to see the changes over 20 years, so we want to utilize the type of remote sensing data set that can go back in time. But we're also thinking about going forward. We need to use the new and more available type of data set, so we need to marry the old data set with the new data set using some type of data fusion using the overlapping years. So that's the first part of it. And second part of it, hyperspectral data, absolutely, that's very helpful, especially for looking at more detailed soil health indicators. For example, some of the nitrogen and carbon indicators that I mentioned in my study using lab spectroscopy, we can't get as good accuracy as soil organic carbon. And the hypothesis is that using hyperspectral, where you have more signal, you will have more leverage to understand that. And one other thing I didn't show is that for the cover crop study, carbon to nitrogen ratio is not estimated as well compared to other features, but by looking at the literature, it looks like hyperspectral can do a much better job with that. Thank you. Yes?
I was really excited to see your decision support tool. It was super cool. I was wondering, who is the audience that was intended for, and are they using it and excited about it?
Okay, sounds good. So the question is about decision support tool, who's the audience, and whether they like it. are excited about it. So I would say the prototype that I showed here, it's a more simplified version, but the online version is more complicated. And we are working with several rangers from the western US, from Colorado, Montana, Utah, and several other places with our network. And they seem to be pretty excited about it because they can see what the carbon changes are over time in 20 years, and also they can see ecosystem productivity. And I would say sometimes they might be a little bit more excited about the ecosystem productivity, moisture, and soil carbon part. And based on our survey, not as much about nitrous oxide yet, but that might change over time when we have more workshops and interactions with them. So I think they're excited, but at the same time, we need to think about maybe the rangers that we're collaborating with, they're already very open-minded about this type of climate-smart agricultural practices, and they're interested in carbon market or that type of concept. So they're very cooperative, and they're nice, and they like this type of decision support tool. But if we want to have a bigger impact to reach out to the broader audience, we definitely need to have more survey or workshop to understand their needs better, to see how we can incorporate different types of information. And this is not just for farmers and ranchers. We also think about policymakers. And for that, we need to be able to go with more details and provide different scenarios for climate management and other things that they would be caring about. Thank you. Yes?
That was a really interesting talk, thank you. I was curious about your project that was in collaboration with WWF and Agroecosystem, and interested in the kinds of biodiversity data that they're bringing to the SCTM system, and particularly interested in what you think will happen when you're able to acquire the agroforestry information, because it seems like the biodiversity will change quite dramatically when you're looking in that kind of a system versus even just like an organic system or a regular crop system, right? Like it could be an exponential difference in biodiversity. Do you have any thoughts about what you expect to see with the agroforestry, and what are the biodiversity kinds of data that are going to be brought to the modeling?
Okay, thank you very much. That's a nice question. So it's about my collaboration with National Audubon Society and WWF, and where they would be bringing additional data sets, such as biodiversity data set, and how we're going to utilize that in RCTM. And also another question is about the measurement of biodiversity in agroforestry system, because it can be a little bit more tricky. So the idea is whether I have thought about how to best utilize those, right? So first about biodiversity, so we have several indices. First, for example, National Audubon Society, they actually have people counting the birds, so that in the end they develop an index called the bird-friendly index. Although I'm not so much of an ecologist, so I might not have the full knowledge about all sorts of biodiversity index, but the other idea is that we will also have the count of other type of wildlife. So the assumption that we want to test here with RCTM is that, okay, if we have an increase in carbon sequestration, does that mean that we have an enhanced ecosystem resilience and health? That would lead to improved biodiversity, because the connection between carbon sequestration and biodiversity is not that direct. So we have to connect that to ecosystem productivity and resilience first. So I would imagine utilizing RCTM, we would be generating estimates at finer resolution for carbon and also for resilience, and then we connected those type of data set with the biodiversity data set, maybe starting with more like a simple correlation and regression, but later on the idea is to be able to incorporate those index into a more integrated model. So that requires not just RCTM, but other type of model that would look at the biodiversity side. And agroforestry, I haven't worked that much on it, and I would imagine it would be more like a data scar system, because I looked a little bit into the literature. So it's like the organic system or other system that I studied where we don't have as much data set. So I would imagine it will take us some efforts to first collect the specific type of data set needed in order to fill the gap, so that we can improve the modeling tool and better understand the connection between carbon and also biodiversity. So we might still be several steps behind in that sense.
So how's the decision support model going to look in the new work for the Hudson Valley? I think you're going to have more stakeholders and potentially more outcomes. So how does that compare with what you're doing with the ranchers in Nebraska with what you're going to do in the Hudson Valley?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I don't need to repeat, right? I can
No.
hear you loud and clear. Okay, so basically, I think one thing is that in the Hudson Valley, maybe we have a lot more medium-sized or small-sized stakeholders. So the idea is that you really need to understand what they want to visualize in terms of the outcome. So in Montana, for example, maybe there's a big range, and then the absolute value in carbon change, even though it's relatively small per unit, but then they can use the land area and times that with carbon, and then they still see that there's a huge change in carbon, and that can allow them to enter something like carbon market more easily. But in the Hudson Valley region, I think we need to consider more on the co-benefit side rather than only being carbon-centered, because there are many other co-benefits that the stakeholders here, they would be particularly interested in. For example, food quality and also soil health. I think that's also something they're passionate about. So I imagine that for the visualization, we want to keep this type of high spatial and temporal resolution, but we want to emphasize that it's not just carbon, but several other agroecosystem outcomes that we care about. And we want to also emphasize the more complicated type of agricultural management scenarios, because there seems to be a combination of different type of climate smart agricultural practices that people are combining in this region, although I'm still relatively new here, but that's the impression I got. So I feel like if we can do a scenario analysis looking at the combination of different practices and go into more detail, that could be more helpful.
All right, a last question from Jane.
Yeah, I'm super curious as you are kind of balancing this stakeholder demand and then policy integration, how you're able to kind of communicate uncertainty in your estimates so that, you know, somebody can't just say like, oh, this is our carbon credit accounting, and so how are you kind of approaching and communicating the uncertainty in your estimates with these people who are maybe really hungry to just start saying, how much money do we give them for carbon at this point in time?
Okay, that's a great question. So it's about uncertainty. How do I quantify those, and how do I communicate those with the stakeholders to avoid this situation where everybody just jump in the carbon market before this type of tool or technology is mature enough. So that's one big thing. So one thing in this MRV type of system, or to try to improve carbon accounting system, is to be able to not only give accurate estimates, but also reduce the uncertainty. So in our modeling tool, I didn't show all the results. The idea is that once we understand the data inputs, that we actually have a data range associated with each of the input. And when we run a model calibration, Bayesian calibration, we also derive the range for the model parameters. So in this case, we can quantify model uncertainty associated with model input and model parameters and put them together. And there's another uncertainty source that is based on model structure. So in order to quantify that, we need to compare different models. So that's where my collaboration with AgMIP is, because we're interested in comparing different type of models and then derive the uncertainty associated with different types of models. And there's also one concept that I didn't mention today, but with AgMIP, one way for us to reduce uncertainty is that we're developing this type of iterative stakeholder engagement network. So the idea is that we will have initial data set from the stakeholders, and then we can delineate model uncertainty based on what we have and compare that with different parameters. And then we have a second round iterative process where we get the feedback from stakeholders, and then we try to refine our parameters, and then we can get additional model to see what the accuracy is and what the new uncertainty level is. And I think it's also important to educate and interact with rangers, stakeholders through those workshops to let them know the benefits and also, of course, the risk associated with carbon market and where we are in terms of the tools. And so far, we have been approached by a lot of companies who are interested in this concept or utilizing RCTM to run carbon market, but we have been pretty cautious and not promising anything because we feel like this model needs to be further improved before we can feel confident about utilizing this for that type of purpose. So that's more like something down the road, but we need to be cautious at the same time.
All right. Well, thank you for a wonderful seminar. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, people online. And we'll have lunch in the lunchroom. And there's one slot in the schedule if someone really wants to meet who wasn't on the schedule. And thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone.